India's GDP component has been revised, and the discrepancies and contentious provisions under the GDP will be revised again.
Prime Minister Modi has hailed 8.2% quarter two GDP growth, calling the numbers very encouraging. The Prime Minister also said that the latest GDP figures highlight the effectiveness of the government's reform-oriented approach.
The RBI has highlighted the latest GDP numbers from July to September. India grew at 8.2%, which is the fastest pace of growth in 6 quarters. India remains among the world's fastest growing major economy.
Honourable Member raised this question about IMF and data issue. I would want to use this opportunity to explain that that debate was very ill-informed.
Now, as you know, very recently, the base year of India's GDP was changed. Earlier, the base year was 2011-2012 and it has been updated to the year 2022-2023. Now, while this was going on, as a part of India's ongoing revision of a GDP data series, the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, that is MOSPI, has proposed eliminating the contentious discrepancies component from the GDP estimates. Now, this particular reform was outlined in MOSPI's discussion paper on methodological improvements and coincidences with the new GDP base year of 2022-2023. And this is to come into effect from 27th of January of 2026. And also the GDP back series data under the revised base year is expected to come by February of 2027. Now, what is this discrepancies component in the GDP? And what has been the recent changes in the GDP data series? And what will be the impact of it? And what has been the changes done by MOSPI? All these things we'll be trying to understand in today's session. Hello, my name is Preetpal Singh and you're watching Perspective. Now, before we start this session, let us very quickly understand what is GDP, because until and unless that is clear, the entire session would be useless. First of all, let's come to the term GDP. Let's break it down. G means gross, D means domestic, and P means product or production. So GDP means gross domestic production. Now, gross refers to the overall value. That is, it includes depreciation as well. So gross refers to the overall value. And if I have to summarize in one line what is GDP, GDP, gross domestic product, refers to the gross value of a final goods and services being produced in an economy, produced within the domestic territory of an economy in one financial year. Again, I'll repeat it for you. GDP, gross domestic product, refers to the gross value of a final goods and services being produced within the domestic territory of a country, within the domestic territory of an economy in one financial year. And if we say India's GDP is $4.1 trillion, which means in a year, India is producing 4.1 trillion worth of final goods and services within the domestic territory of India. That is what you mean by GDP. Now, calculation of GDP is very technical. In total, there are 2 approaches, and in total, there are 3 methods. 2 approaches. First approach is production approach, and second approach is expenditure approach. Now, under production approach, there are 2 methods. One is a value-added method, or one more method is second method, that is income method. And the third approach, that is expenditure approach, comes up with the third method, that is expenditure method. So in total, there are 3 methods to calculate the GDP of a country. One method is the value addition method, second method is income method, and third one is expenditure method. Now, in each of these methods, the amount of GDP which is calculated. See, let's say, for example, in value addition method, we see value addition in each of the sectors in an economy. Primary sector, secondary sector, and tertiary sector, we get to know the GDP. In income method, we have certain components. First component is the component of compensation of employees. Second is the component of mixed income of self-employed. And third component is of operating surplus, which includes rent, wages, and interest. All these 3 components together forms your income method. And then there is fourth method, that is expenditure method, which includes again 4 components. One is consumption, second is investment, third is government expenditure, and fourth one is net exports. Now, in all these 3 methods, we are able to calculate GDP from different perspectives. One is from the perspective of value addition, one is from the perspective of incomes, one is from the perspective of expenditure. Now, the problem here is when we calculate GDP with these methods, the resultant GDP with each of the method is not the same. That is where the problem rises. In production methods, when we calculate GDP, and during expenditure method, when we calculate GDP, the resultant GDP figure is not same always. And this resultant figure not being same with the two methods is what we call as a discrepancy in GDP. Now you might ask a question, why there is discrepancy? See, first of all, the methods are different, which is why there will be differences in data sources also. There will be differences in coverage of the data. There is differences in valuation methods, and there might be certain time lags also in the data calculation, which is why often it happens that the GDP estimates in these two methods, these two approaches often do not match. And the difference between the two approaches is recorded as a discrepancy under the expenditure side of the GDP, which is usually considered as relatively less accurate. Now, what kind of discrepancy can be there? Either there can be a positive discrepancy or there can be a negative discrepancy. Positive discrepancy simply means when the production side GDP, with the production methods GDP which is calculated, is higher than the GDP which is calculated through expenditure method. That is a positive discrepancy. Negative discrepancy is when through production method the GDP which is calculated is lesser than the GDP which is calculated by expenditure method. So simply speaking, negative discrepancy occurs when expenditure side GDP is higher than the production side. This is about discrepancies, which means I just explained this to you to make you understand that discrepancies do exist while we calculate GDP through different approaches. Now, the first thing which you know is that there are discrepancies. Now, second thing which you ought to know is that why are these discrepancies problematic? What is the problem with these discrepancies? See, the biggest problem with the discrepancies is that they obscure the true drivers of GDP growth, and they also complicate macroeconomic analysis. Because if discrepancy exists, macroeconomic analysis becomes very difficult. And driver of GDP growth, it becomes more obscure. And if discrepancies are too large, it can lead to significant revisions of the future GDP growth rates as well, which is why it is very problematic. But then the question is, how do we reform it? That is a topic which we are covering today, that discrepancies will be reformed by MOSPI. Now, MOSPI, Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, they plan to integrate the supply and use tables, we call it as SUTs, with annual and national accounts. Now, what do you mean by supply and use tables or integrating it with annual national accounts? It simply means that SUTs, that is supply and use tables, will be used to ensure that the total supply. Now, the supply and use tables, it will be used to first of all ensure that the total supply of goods and services is equal to the total use of every goods and services. If that is ensured, then we will be able to make sure that the discrepancy is limited. Because if total supply of goods and services is equal to the total usage, then the discrepancies would be much less. So definitely it aims to limit discrepancies in the GDP, in the early GDP estimates, and also it eliminates them entirely in final estimates once the full data also becomes available. So basically just one change is being made, that the supply and use tables will be integrated with the annual national accounts. That's all. With this one change, we will be able to limit the discrepancies. That is what MOSPI is saying. Now you might ask this question, that what do you mean by the supply and use table? See, supply and use table is a table which maps the domestic production, that is the supply of goods and services, domestic production, and imports against intermediate consumption. Supply and use. So supply is the production and use is the consumption. So it maps the total supply, that is, it maps the domestic production and imports against intermediate consumption, against final consumption, against capital formation and exports as well. This is what supply and use table does. Now, when we integrate supply and use table with the annual national accounts, what we are trying to do is that we are trying to equate the total supply of goods and services with the total usage of goods and services as well. And once that is done in the estimates, definitely the discrepancies would be moving away. Now, many experts are saying that it will lead to more transparency. It will eliminate discrepancies. It will lead to more transparency. It will improve transparency, and it will improve interpretability of GDP data as well. If there is discrepancy, then interpretability of data is questionable, which is why it's very important when discrepancies are waded away or moved away. Also, because earlier there was persistent and rising discrepancy in the GDP estimates, it undermined the confidence in growth estimates very vigorously, which is why once these discrepancies are gone, the confidence of individuals on GDP data, on growth estimates would be much more greater. Now, that does not mean that the questions are not still there. Questions are still there on the quality of data, especially relying on the outdated survey data. The questions are still there, but questions in relation to discrepancies will be solved once this particular method will be adopted, which is why this particular method is very laudable. Now, last but not the least, the question is, are there certain challenges in this particular part or not? The answer is yes. See, first of all, there is inherent complexity of GDP calculation. GDP estimation, first of all, is very large. Second of all, informal sector is in our country, very, very huge informal sector is there in our country. It's very huge. And plus our economy is very diverse, which is why the data which is used, we don't have much institutional capacity in our country for proper national accounts compilation. We don't have much institutional capacity in our country for proper national accounts compilation, which is why institutional capacity needs to increase. That is one thing. And another problem is that we already have outdated survey data and data gaps. Particularly, it is in the services sector and informal sector where it is very difficult to get the data. And plus, there is a problem of time gaps and uneven quality of administrative data as well. And which is why the suggestion is that you strengthen the administrative data systems and real-time data collection in the country as well. And that can only be done through structural reforms carried out inside Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation, and especially National Statistical Organization. And the biggest risk is the concern of transparency. And this can be solved by aligning very, very closely with the system of national accounts. If we align closely with the system of national accounts, see, if we align ourselves with the international best practices, definitely these transparency concerns will be very well solved. So overall speaking, once the GDP of India is calculated, this discrepancy portion from two different methods, that the production method and the expenditure method, can cause very vague statistical problems in our country. Which is why, to solve these statistical problems, MOSPI has come up with a new method. The new method we have already discussed, and this new method will pave a very good way for our country's statistical analysis to be done in a more accurate and better way. It will increase accountability, it will increase transparency, it will increase the responsibility of MOSPI, plus it will make the data more robust and more accurate, which is why it will make the data more trustworthy as well, and the trustworthiness of the data published on a GDP growth estimates of our country would also improve. Which is why this particular change is inherently, statistically for our country, very, very important. Do let me know what are your views surrounding this. And one more question which I would like to ask all of you is that, is GDP a good measure to measure economic well-being of a country or not? Do let me know in the comment section your answer. All the very best. Have a beautiful day. Thank you.